Hello, welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, New Year's Eve, after dark now, 2023, the last evening of the year, and here I am talking to you. Hopefully you have a fun evening, whatever makes New Year's Eve fun to you. Me, I just cooked a ham, ate way too much. And we'll probably attempt to stay awake until midnight. I buy some sparkling cider so we can all have some. My son, my wife, and I. And yeah, pretty low key. But in the past, I have been out freezing myself and watching the ball drop. Never been to New York City, but in our local city. And yeah, I can watch it from the couch or wake up tomorrow and realize, hey, it's a new year. I'm sitting next to a beautiful example of a 1979 Turbo Hydramatic 350, TH350 from a silver anniversary Trans Am. So it's what, 44 or 5 years old-ish? It is beautiful. I mean, just look at the metal. There's no rust. It's I hope it's as nice inside, and I'm going to find out in the next day or so. But before I even attempt to shoot a video about the TH350, it got me thinking about how'd we get here. And if you go back in time, since the beginning of the automobile, the manufacturers are mostly Henry Ford to start with, although there was a lot of small companies. He's the most famous, but there was a lot of people trying to build automobiles. And if you've ever seen or know anybody that knows how to drive a Model T, that was not a manual or an automatic. I'm not sure what you'd call it. A bunch of bands and stuff, I think. But Model T was definitely a manual transmission. But in the early 1900s, they were already working on fluid couplings to try to replace a manual clutch to make it easier for drivers, a theme that still continues today. And the first, at least recognized in this country, mass-produced automatic transmission was the Hydramatic. Oldsmobile and Cadillac, I think, engineered it, and Cadillac said to Oldsmobile, you go ahead first, because they didn't want a failure on their hands. The 4-speed Hydramatic was, again, this is in a time where manual transmissions either weren't synchronized at all, so you had to be careful when you shifted. If you're familiar with shifting a truck transmission, you know what I'm talking about. And then they started to synchronize just the higher gears, not the lower gears. So almost anything automatic, if it worked, was going to be welcome to a lot of people. And the Hydramatic was that. It was a massive cast iron 4-speed with like a 3-something first gear, almost 3.5 first gear, because the fluid coupling doesn't have any torque multiplication like a torque converter does. The plus side to that, while it didn't help you take off, so they geared the transmission so it would accelerate. Second gear was higher, higher numerically than most modern 3-speeds, modern, 50 years old. But the plus side to the fluid coupling versus a torque converter is at highway speeds, it wasn't completely 1-to-1, but it was close. There wasn't the slippage that we lived with and still do with a traditional 3-speed. And like, for instance, a Turbo 400 never got a lockup torque converter. The TH350 did. But until the lockup torque converter, efficiency was not matched from the early Hydramatic fluid coupling. The early Hydramatic was a success. It came out, it was engineered and came out in 39 of 40, and it was in production of some sort all the way through World War II into the 63 or 4 a year. I mean, that's a heck of a run for one model transmission. They improved it some. During World War II, it was in tanks. I mean, it was a rugged unit. 400 to 600 pounds of cast iron beauty, depending on what it was going to be installed in. In the early 50s, the Hydramatic plant, assembly plant, caught fire, which really put a crimp into a lot of manufacturers who were using the Hydramatic. It wasn't just General Motors. It was Nash, Rambler, Willys, Lincoln, Rolls-Royce, Bentley. I mean, there's a lot of manufacturers, kind of like the Turbo 400 in its heyday, that wanted to just buy a transmission and use it in their product. Believe it or not, then this is after World War II when we could do anything. The country as a whole had just, succeeded in World War II, and we're an industrial giant, we're making highways, we can do anything. 9 weeks later, they had the production plant, a new one set up at Willow Run. If you know anything about Willow Run, it's a famous assembly plant for fighter planes and bombers and such. And it was building transmissions now in 9 weeks after the big fire that ruined the other plant. At that time, during the scramble after the fire, Buick had already developed their Dynaflow. So most of Chevrolet was working on the cast iron Power Glide. So there was other options for the General Motors vehicles, but the other companies, Ford and such, they kind of leaned on Borg Warner, who had been working, kind of like they always have been, alongside the Big Three or more. There was more than Big Three back then. And so they kind of went that direction. Borg Warner has all kinds of their own. I think they originally built the Fordomatic and etc. So, they built a different product, different engineers at the time. The sky was the limit for what they could come up with. In the late 50s into the early 60s, there was now probably 6 or 7 versions of GM automatics. You name it. Ultramatic, Jetaway, I already mentioned Dynaflow, Stratomatic, or whatever. It was, you name it. Everything was rockets and fins, and the sky's the limit in the name. And this, we weren't even quite into the space race yet. In the early 60s we were, but everything was airplane or rocket or, stratospheric themed. In the 60s, up to the mid-60s, well, and beyond that, but before, for instance, the Turbo 400 was born, companies, especially B&M, there's still a company now. B&M stands for, it's the first name of the two guys that designed it. I don't think it's the last name. I think they use the first names. But if you watch, for instance, the movie Hollywood Nights, Tony Danza is wearing a B&M Hydro shirt. Hydro Stick, I think they called it. They were already making parts so you could go drag racing with that massive cast iron 4-speed automatic. Hey, it was that or whatever manual transmissions there were at the time. So, believe it or not, people tried to go racing with that thing and did. All those transmissions I just mentioned, I mean, I am an online shopper. Before that, I was a, paper, whatever rag had a for sale sign, for sale items in it. I'm 58 years old. You seldom, if ever, see any of those early automatics for sale. Nobody wants them. They have zero value almost. It wasn't until, I guess they do if you're restoring a vehicle. Don't take me wrong if you're one of those, but me, I worked at a transmission shop in the early 80s, and we hardly ever saw any of them. We'd walk by it and say, what the heck is that? Because by 62, we had the aluminum Power Glide. And 64 into 65, the Turbo 400 was born. 1969, the TH350 was born. And these were, while they all have history and roots into the ones we've talked about, they were a drastic improvement. Lightweight, strong, efficient. Like I say, the Turbo 350 eventually, in the early 80s, if you see it with a neck down input shaft with an O-ring, it had a lockup torque converter, the 350C. There was other versions of the TH350 basically they were just to go behind weaker engines. The 250, which had an external band adjustment. They tried a few different things. Fortunately, the majority of them were just like this, 3-speed. I'm not a huge TH350 fan of people that try to do more than it's capable of. Now, in a street rod or even a light truck, but you know, a Nova, and we're talking a street driving vehicle, you're gonna go get ice cream, maybe fool around every now and then, it's fine. But and when we take it apart, I will show you some of the reasons why it's not a Turbo 400. It's physically smaller, the input shaft is longer and smaller, there's reasons why it's weaker, and it has limitations. Doesn't matter how much you spend on it or how much power people say it will take, it's not gonna replace something that's physically built and engineered better. By comparison, from the Turbo 400, the 4L80E was born. They share a lot of parts, and they're considered strong. The TH350 morphed into the 700R4, which became the 4L60, and their history, strength-wise, isn't that great if you try to operate it out of its wheelhouse. Even in its intended wheelhouse, you better be nice to it. That's all I can say about their strength. If you're standing at the crossroads and you're wondering if this is enough, you probably answered your own question. So that's a brief history anyway on this New Year's night. I hope you, again, have a great evening, safe. At least the weather's cooperating tonight. It rained here lightly, but it rained for about 4 days. Nothing but mist and rain. We didn't get great amounts like we did the 2 weekends previous to that. We've been, well, nobody's hollering drought right here in the Northeast, let's put it that way. And I don't know how it is in your parts of the country, but we got plenty of liquid on the ground. And unfortunately last night, well, the rain was supposed to stop at noon. It stopped at 8 o'clock at night, and it went right below freezing, and now they had to go salt the roads and sand the roads, depending on which road you're talking about. And now, instead of the roads being all rinsed off from 4 days of rain, at the very end, they had to make a mess again. So for me, that grounds a lot of my vehicles. I don't drive them in the salt. I got one I will sacrifice, but again, living my whole life in the Northeast and 27 or 8 years working on plow equipment that actually put the salt out. I'm the guy you want to get mad at. We installed calcium tanks. We put road controls to control how much you're putting out per mile, but we were still putting it out because people don't want to be inconvenienced by the weather. That's the difference. I don't understand how people can spend, I mean, half-ton trucks now, some are over $100,000. And with the stuff that's put on the roads these days, that thing is rusted out in 5 years. So, it's sad. Anyway, I digress. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Next year at this point.